So welcome to the 11th edition of the SOLAS Seminar. My name is Damian Arévalo-Martínez, and together with Karin, I will be hosting two wonderful speakers on the topic of energy gas exchange in warm polar regions, impacts of changing sea ice cape. The way it will work today is that we have two talks. Each of them will be of 20 minutes. And after the talks are completed, we will have an open discussion where you can ask questions. You can either write them on the chat as we go, or you can raise your digital hand later on when we reach the discussion phase. As it were. Before we jump into that, I would like to shortly hand over to Karin, who will say a few words about SOLAS, especially for those of you who are joining for the first time.
Okay, hello everyone. So I did want to just give a brief introduction to SOLAS as a project. So this is the Surface Ocean Lower Atmosphere Study Project. It's been running since 2004. It's an international research initiative that aims to understand the key biogeochemical and physical interactions and their feedbacks between the ocean and the atmosphere. So at the moment, it has more than 1,200 members worldwide, and this is including 34 regional or national networks, and it has more than 14 nationalities in the membership. We have both a scientific steering committee as well as an early career scientist committee, and these have rotating appointments. SOLAS really crosses disciplines of oceanography, biology, ecology, physics, chemistry, atmospheric sciences, and more recently, social sciences, law, and policy. SOLAS hosts a biannual summer school, as well as a biannual open science conference, and also offers some funds for workshops via application. It also offers some funding for research within the surface ocean lower atmosphere domain. It sponsors projects also via application, and then SOLAS will also sometimes endorse projects that are funded by other means. So the SOLAS webinar series is covering different parts of the SOLAS domain. This is the first of a series that will continue over the next year or so, so just watch for advertisements. SOLAS is also publishing summaries of the latest science that's aimed at policymakers, and it also collects relevant new literature from members into these national syntheses. So we have reports that come out every year. SOLAS is now 20 years old, and it's starting to plan for the next 10 years. So there is a SOLAS 3.0 science plan that is nearing completion, and I just wanted to advertise that it will be launched during a town hall at the Ocean Sciences meeting in Glasgow in February. So watch for communications about this, and I hope to see many of you there. But let's move now into the talks.
All right, very good. Thank you, Karin, for the introduction to SOLAS and SOLAS activities. So it is my pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Josefa Verdugo. She's a postdoctoral researcher at the Department of Biology of Aarhus University in Denmark. And well, first of all, thanks, Josefa, for being here and sharing some of your insights on CO2 dynamics in the Arctic. So I would say the stage is yours.
And now. So now you can see all my screen, right?
Yes.
Yeah, super. So thank you very much, Damian, and also Karin for the invitation. I'm super happy to be here and to present the results of the research that I have been doing during my postdoc at Aarhus University. Today we will talk about how, when, and why meltwater shapes the pCO₂ below the ice. So to introduce the topic, there is clear evidence over the past at least 20 years that Arctic summer sea ice is retreating at unprecedented rates due to an increase in atmospheric temperatures. So in fact, the Arctic is warming faster than elsewhere, and the sea ice decline in the Arctic is kind of a symbol or like a signature of climate change. The sea ice decline, along sea ice decline, more fresh water is released into the upper ocean, which impacts the ocean, the upper ocean circulation and the stratification of the water column. But the sea ice in the Arctic Ocean is not only changing in extent, but also it's changing in volume and thickness. This means that the sea ice in the Arctic Ocean is shifting from a multi-year ice, which is a thick and complex ice, to a more fragile and thinner first-year ice, which is more vulnerable to oceanic and atmospheric forcings. Since sea ice limits the gas exchange between the ocean and the atmosphere, changes in the ice regimes can have unknown effects on the pathways of gases such as CO2 in the Arctic Ocean. This is especially true because the sea ice formation and melting cycles have pronounced impacts on the CO2 in seawater. In autumn and winter, there is a fluent exchange of CO2 between the ocean and the atmosphere, and normally CO2 is uptaken by seawater during this period. As soon as sea ice starts to form in winter, and sea ice becomes impermeable, it restricts the exchange between the ocean and the atmosphere, and CO2 supersaturated brine is released into the seawater beneath, and CO2 starts to accumulate below the sea ice. In addition, some heterotrophic activity could also further increase the pCO₂ below the sea ice. However, during autumn and winter, the saturation of CO2 doesn't always reach close or above atmospheric levels. So it has been reported that CO2 could still be the seawater could still be undersaturated in pCO₂ during these periods. By contrast, during spring and summer, sea ice snow starts to melt, and fresh water depleted in CO2 is released into the underlying seawater, which lowers pCO₂ in seawater. In addition, primary production also drawdowns pCO₂, which lowers even more pCO₂ during the summertime. Also, regarding melt ponds, which is a mixture between snow and sea ice that forms during the summer melt with increasing temperatures, it has been also reported that they act as a modest sink for atmospheric CO2, and recent research has also reported that when melt pond water is mixed with seawater, it decreases the pCO₂ because of the non-linearities in the carbonate system. So we know that sea ice melt and snow melt affects the pCO₂ in the under icy water, but we still don't know how these different meltwater sources like snow, sea ice, and melt ponds will affect the under ice pCO₂ balance. So that's the research questions for today that we want to answer. So for that, to answer this question, we went to Young Sound. This is a fjord that is located at northeast Greenland, and this is a fjord that is covered by sea ice most of the year, from October, November until mid-July. And there are also, so the fjord waters are influenced by different freshwater sources, such as precipitation, river runoff that passes through different terrains and is connected with the Greenland ice sheet, and as well snow and sea ice melt. So to answer the question of how meltwater influence the pCO₂, we collected samples during the summer though in the fjord, And when we went there, we encountered a sea ice with almost 1.5 meter thick and a snow coverage of 60 centimeters. So we have a thick sea ice and snow on top of the seawater. We deploy 2 different sensors. So one was a pCO₂ sensor that measured pCO₂ continuously at 2.5 meters below the ice. And along with, together with pCO₂, we also measured salinity and temperature continuously. And we also collected samples, discrete samples for water isotopes, total alkalinity, and DIC in different compartments like sea ice, snow, melt ponds, and seawater to resolve, like, the carbonate chemistry during this period. So now we go directly to the results, and we will discuss accordingly. So in the above panel, in the upper panel, we see in black temperature, in green salinity, and in the lower panel we see pCO₂ in purple. So what do we see here is that in the beginning of June, during the melt onset period, we see that the temperature, salinity, and the pCO₂ remain relatively stable. However, by mid-June, we see a drastic drop of salinity associated to a freshwater input, and also very well correlated with a pCO₂ drop of about 90 microatmosphere. By late June, we observed a second drop in salinity and also associated and correlated with a pCO₂ drop. This salinity decreases were caused by freshwater input, but from different sources, which we will discuss now. So first, to decipher the processes that might contribute to this pCO₂ reduction, we will go through several physical and biological processes. So first, we will talk about vertical mixing. So vertical mixing was discharged as an option of the pCO₂, as a process that will contribute with the pCO₂ reduction, because by the beginning of June, we observed that a formation of a meltwater layer in the upper water column, and shown by a decrease in salinity and then a slightly increase in temperature, which stratifies the upper water column, which inhibits the vertical mixing. In addition, if deeper waters were the source for the pCO₂ reduction, we will need more than 90% of deeper water to be upwell into the surface water. So, and in that case, in that scenario, it will have increased the pCO₂, because it will have increased. So vertical mixing was discharged as an option. So now we will go into, we will discuss about the potential freshwater sources that might influence the pCO₂ underneath the sea ice. So precipitation was not the cause, because the effect of the precipitation in the fjord is negligible, only accounts for 0.4 microatmosphere in the pCO₂ reduction. So was also not the cause. And now we go with river runoff. So river runoff in the area, the major catchment is the Zackenberg River. And by the time of our sampling, we calculated pCO₂ in the river based on pH, TA, salinity, and temperature measured in situ. And we calculated that with the pCO₂ system, and it's higher than 2000 microatmosphere. But when we mixed the seawater with river water, we only have a decrease of 2 microatmosphere. So the river is also negligible and discharged as an option for our pCO₂ reduction. Now we move into snow and sea ice melt. So if you remember this plot, we observed that the freshwater input and the salinity decrease and the pCO₂ decrease, the first salinity and pCO₂ decrease are associated to snow meltwater. The delta oxygenectene, the water isotopes, reveal that the oxygenectene becomes diluted, as you can see here in the red regression, becomes diluted with salinity when salinity decreases. And at salinity 0, our intercept shows that the oxygenectene in seawater will be minus 19, which aligns very well with those values found in snow meltwater. So the first freshwater input was caused by snow meltwater. The second freshwater input was associated to melt pond water. So when the water isotopes becomes further diluted, if you follow the blue line, becomes further diluted with salinity decrease, and the end member or the oxygenectene in seawater are in the same range of those values that we found in melt pond water. So the second freshwater input was caused by melt pond drainage. So in summary, the first one is associated to snow meltwater, and the second one by melt pond drainage. And now we will discuss how these different freshwater sources influence the carbonate chemistry below the ice. So we wanted to see if conservative mixing will explain our variability in DIC. So for that, we computed a DIC at a fixed pCO₂, or 401, that was the atmospheric level at the time of our sampling. And this plot tells us that our measured DIC aligns very well with our computed DIC. And this indicates that most of the variability in DIC is driven by dilution. This means by a mixture between snow meltwater and the under ice seawater. This is because DIC, as you can see here in the plot of TA and DIC ratio over salinity, DIC is diluted faster than TA when salinity decreases. And this causes that pCO₂, and it correlates well with pCO₂ measured by our sensor, that the changes or an increase in the TA and DIC ratio lowers pCO₂ in the under ice seawater during the time when snow meltwater was detected underlying in the under ice seawater. This is something that has been reported before. This is a plot taken by a paper from Yoshimura et al. 2025. So this data is from the Mosaic drift experiment in the Central Arctic Ocean, and they show they collected samples in melt pond water and in seawater, and they show that when melt pond water mixes with seawater, pCO₂ decreases drastically, and this is because the nonlinearities in the carbonate system. So our findings aligned very well with those found by Yoshimura et al. So we also wanted to calculate how much decrease it will cause if we mix seawater with snow and seawater with sea ice. So using salinity, temperature, the total alkalinity, and the dissolved inorganic carbon in sea ice and snow and seawater, we observed that snow causes a decrease of about 60 microatmosphere, and the sea ice about 24 microatmosphere. So most of the pCO₂ reduction will be caused by mixing with snow and sea ice meltwater. So finally, we also needed to include the primary production because it has been also reported that primary producers will cause a drawdown in pCO₂ during under ice blooms. So this is a plot of a normalized total alkalinity and DIC, which shows the residuals, so processes that are beyond dilution. So we have the signal of photosynthesis, of CO2 uptake. And when we calculate how much pCO₂ will be drawn down by primary production using two different methods, so by chlorophyll or by nitrate consumption, we see that we estimate that it will be a maximum amount of 37 microatmosphere. So this means that primary production contributed like only modestly, and most of the pCO₂ reduction is due to physical processes such as mixing. Yes, so as a take-home message, I wanted to say that meltwater from snow and sea ice melt doesn't simply dilute seawater, but it also alters its carbonate chemistry, which drives a strong pCO₂ reduction and disequilibria that are key to understand future Arctic CO₂ fluxes. And also melt pond drainage initiates atmosphere under ice seawater connection, even though we had 1.5 meter thick sea ice. And this connection enables atmospheric CO₂ uptake due to the under ice undersaturation in pCO₂. So thank you very much. And now I leave the door to John.
Many thanks, Josefa, for the very nice talk. I'm sure there will be some questions for the end, for the discussion phase. So again, for the audience, maybe some of you came late, so please write down your questions either on the chat or elsewhere and have them ready for the open discussion at the end. And for now, I would like to introduce our next speaker, John Prytherch, who is a senior scientist at the Department of Earth Sciences of Uppsala University in Sweden. So, John, many thanks again for accepting the invitation. We look forward to hear about some of your thoughts on Earth gas exchange in polar regions.
Great, thanks, Josefa. Thanks, Damian. Yeah, can you see my screen okay? Yep.
Yes.
Yes. Yes.
Perfect. Okay. Let me just move this away. Okay. Yep. So my name's John, and see, this is work by myself, but also many other people, some of whom are mentioned here. Any mistakes are, of course, my own. And I'm going to talk about what we can say about air-sea gas exchange in regions like that shown in the photo, where sea ice is at least seasonally present. And to keep things more concise, the results I'll show will largely focus on the Arctic region and on CO₂ in particular. But many of the things I talk about apply to sea ice regions around Antarctica and elsewhere, and also to other climate relevant gases. Okay. So, right. So what do we know about air-sea gas exchange in the Arctic? Well, the Arctic Ocean is a relatively small part of the global ocean, but we estimate that it plays quite a substantial role in the global ocean CO₂ sink. And there is generally this kind of strong undersaturation of CO₂ in Arctic surface waters. So here's a map from a really nice recent paper by Dutch et al., where they have a kind of annual mean pCO₂ that they've constructed from SOCAT data using some kind of self-organizing map neural network interpolation technique. And you can see here in this kind of annual mean that in most of these Arctic waters, the undersaturation is at least kind of 100 microatmospheres or so. So a strong sink if there's no ice in the way to kind of obstruct it. Now this kind of large unsaturation is in part due to the sea ice cover itself and to features of the large scale circulation. And how this might change in the future is a really important open question, but somewhat beyond the scope of this talk. Also want to highlight the kind of real limited number of observations in this region. So this is kind of highlights the kind of SOCAT compendium of pCO₂ measurements, but there's generally in much of the Arctic, there's very few observations, and they're very concentrated in particular seasons, particularly the summer when icebreakers can actually get into this region, and in certain areas of the Arctic. So this contributes to the quite large uncertainty in the regional flux estimate. So here's a flux estimate from Yasunaka using a kind of a similar approach to the SOCAT data and this kind of some kind of neural network technique to get a regional flux estimate. And you can see that the uncertainties on these estimates are quite large. And part of this is due to the sparse pCO₂ data in this region, but part of it is also due to how we represent the gas exchange in these kind of sea ice affected regions. And this is highlighted here by this quite large difference between these two estimates from the same paper, which purely depend just on how you scale the gas transfer rate with sea ice, whether linearly or non-linearly, which we'll look at in a bit more detail later. Okay, and sticking with this nice paper from Dutch et al., I wanted to highlight something else that they did. They did this kind of sensitivity analysis of different parts of the gas exchange, of how gas exchange is represented. And that's shown in this kind of bar chart here. And here the y-axis is a 32-year cumulative CO2 flux for the Arctic region. And they looked at 3 parts of how we represent gas exchange and the sensitivity of this estimate to them. And the first one they looked at is just which choice of the gas transfer velocity, K, they made. And they used 3 different ones, Wannenkopf, Nightingale, 2 of the kind of common open ocean parameterizations, and one of my parameterizations, which was for kind of sea ice regions, which they then merged with Wannenkopf for times when there wasn't any sea ice present. So those ones are represented here. So this is the Wannenkopf one, these 2 columns, and then there's the my one, and then there's the Nightingale one here. So which of these kind of representations of K, wind speed dependent representations of K you choose makes some difference, but not a huge difference to this flux estimate. It's maybe not surprising because at least at first glance, these estimates don't differ that much in this kind of average wind speed range around here. Okay. Secondly, they looked at how you scale the gas exchange of sea ice. So this left-hand side of the bar chart is using this kind of what we call a linear scaling. So this is the fraction of sea ice in each kind of measurement cell, measurement estimate. So this is the linear scaling of the flux equation, and then this is a non-linear scaling of the flux equation on this side, using this estimate from one of Bryce Luce's laboratory studies. And the difference here is then quite a bit larger. So this makes quite a large difference depending on how you choose this representation. Of course, we don't have a really good idea of what the correct representation here is, as we'll see. So there's quite a lot of uncertainty here. And then the third factor Dutch et al. Looked at was whether to treat situations where there is 100% sea ice cover, whether you treat it as 100% or as somewhat less, as in their case 90% sea ice cover, to allow some gas exchange through the leads or whatever kind of cracks in the sea ice are present in pretty much all seasons in these sea ice areas. So that is then the difference between these kind of pairs of columns, like here and here and here and here. You can see this can actually make quite some difference how we choose this. And again, there's quite some uncertainty about how best to represent this type of process. Okay. And one thing that wasn't kind of explicitly covered in the Dutch et al. Paper is something that Josefa talked a little bit about, was kind of gas exchange through the sea ice itself. So through these kind of brine channels and other parts of the sea ice kind of matrix, there is paths for gas to exchange. In particular, gas can be released from the sea ice during the freeze-up process. So when the water freezes, the ice matrix kind of rejects this salt into these kind of very saline brines, and also rejects the CO2. So there can be quite strong kind of CO2 release during the freeze-up process, which can lead to CO2 going into the water, but also kind of CO2 gas going up into the atmosphere. Similarly, during the melt, then a lot of kind of relatively fresh, low pCO2 water is exposed to the air, so we can have a larger kind of downwards flux then, as that there's a strong pCO2 gradient between the atmosphere and this kind of fresh water that's formed. And there's some kind of temperature dependence to all this, and some kind of chemistry, as Josefa talked about in her talk. But an important thing is that this exchange is generally much slower than the exchange through the water. So from some lab studies, this Kvale et al. Paper estimated that these gas transfer rates in sea ice were around 30 or more times slower than typical gas transfer rates in open water. It's kind of shown here. Okay. Now, of course, while these gas transfer rates are quite slow, there's a lot of sea ice, so it can still be an important thing to take account of. So this graph is of the BEPC compilation of CO2 chamber measurements that Odile Krabek and colleagues are putting together. So this is work in progress, but I just wanted to show this here because I think it's some really nice work, and it shows that In the top here, we have kind of Arctic measurements of air ice flux from chambers, and in the bottom, the same for the Antarctic region. You can see these have been divided into kind of monthly averages. And although seasonally these fluxes might be significant, these kind of winter outgassing fluxes are kind of offset by this summer uptake fluxes here. So these are the dark columns here, the air ice fluxes. And the net annual flux is then very small compared to typical kind of ocean region. Oh, sorry, I should say polar region ocean fluxes, which are these kind of estimates here. But you should also note that there's a very limited number of measurements in certain seasons here. E.g., during the onset of melt, there's very few of these kind of chamber air ice measurements. So I'll highlight there's still some uncertainty here. Okay, but so another question we then come to is a linear scaling of gas transfer by sea ice concentration appropriate? So now we're talking about the kind of water surface gas transfer in the sea ice regions. And one of the bases for assuming this is an appropriate scaling is this large compilation of eddy covariance flux measurements from an icebreaker in the Southern Ocean put together by Brian Butterworth and colleagues in 2016. And when they took their kind of gas transfer measurements from their eddy covariance system on their icebreaker, something like this, and scaled them by open ocean gas transfer measurements, and then bin them by sea ice concentration, which is here on the x-axis, they get this very clear linear relationship. So their measurements are the blue bin measurements here, and they're very clearly kind of scale linearly with sea ice concentration. And that's in contrast to this this model by Bryce Luce and colleagues, which is this kind of shaded region here, which predicted an enhanced gas transfer. I should note that Bryce's model has been substantially updated since this point. So it's yeah, there's quite some changes to that model since then. Okay, but my own eddy covariance measurements, also from an icebreaker, this time in the Arctic, which were less numerous than Brian Butterworth's measurements, but they show kind of the same thing. So this is the same kind of plot, but with the x-axis flipped, and you can see that these measurements just about support a kind of linear scaling of this gas transfer with sea ice concentration again. Again, this kind of shaded region is this kind of model showing some enhanced gas transfer. I just want to mention here, I'm not going to talk much more about the ship-based eddy covariance, other than to say it's a really kind of challenging measurement to make, and it requires very careful correction for things like platform motion, flow distortion. And for better or for worse, these measurements integrate flux over a relatively large footprint, a relatively large area, which includes all the surfaces within that footprint. This can be a good thing or a bad thing, but at high sea ice concentration, there's a very small air-sea flux signal to measure. So then there can be a real signal to noise issue with these measurements in this kind of region and this kind of region of these plots, as these are not very particularly sensitive measurement systems. All right, now in the interest of time, I'm going to skip talking about the nonlinear sea ice dependence of gas transfer, other than to say there's some really nice papers by Bryce Luce and his group using both lab measurements, but also some field observations which show perhaps a kind of enhanced gas transfer, or in some cases a reduced gas transfer relative to a linear scaling. Okay, I'll just skip through those there. Okay, and then that then brings us to a real kind of key challenge in these sea ice regions, is that the sea ice surface and similarly the water surfaces in between the sea ice surface have kind of spatial variability on a very large number of physical scales, from varying from kind of 100 or 1,000 kilometer, this kind of large scale variability, down to this kind of meter scale variability. And as well as this spatial variability, they also have quite strong heterogeneity. So the sea ice within a satellite's measurement footprint, or an eddy covariance footprint, for example, or a model grid cell, is not necessarily evenly distributed within that cell, but it might be, well, maybe it's kind of evenly distributed somewhat like this, where you can say, okay, the water's kind of averagely distributed here, or it could be like this. So it's all kind of bunched up on one part of your kind of measurement area. And this has important effects on the waves, on the water surface turbulence, and so through that on the gas exchange. So here again are some kind of various features of the sea ice landscape and the wide range of spatial and temporal scales associated with them. Here's leads, for example, spanning very many kind of scales here. And I've highlighted here the relevant scales of various flux measurement techniques, and chambers, various eddy covariants, and so on, that I mentioned in this talk. And these larger scales can integrate over these various surfaces and processes. And of course, the smaller scales allow us to kind of really measure the particular surfaces that we're interested in. Just as a kind of example of this, here we have a kind of map of evolution of a particular lead system close to the North Pole during the 5 weeks of a summer campaign in 2018, along with the footprint of an eddy covariance mast, which is placed at the kind of edge of this lead. And this is a 3-meter high mast, and then this footprint, these contours, this is the kind of measurement area for the eddy covariance sensors. This varies with wind direction, of course, and with atmospheric stability. But we can also see that the lead itself, this blue area, is quite dynamic. It's varying a lot in size and shape due to the ice movement during these kind of 5 weeks. But we can use this, combine these kind of areas together, do a kind of analysis or to enable us to isolate what the flux is through these lead waters. And this was the method we used to determine this this relationship that was used in the Dutch et al. Paper I showed at the start, where we get this blue line here relative to these typical open ocean values and show this kind of reduction of maybe a third relative to what we might expect in the open ocean. Presumably, although we didn't measure it directly, due to the reduced wave field, reduced kind of mixing turbulence in the lead. There's also, in this experiment, we had some indication that there was a fetch dependence in this gas transfer, but it was somewhat unclear due to the relatively small ranges of fetches that we were able to measure in this small lead. I say small lead, but it was actually, of course, a relatively large lead for these kind of sea ice environments. But leads are often much smaller, and these kind of small, or at least thinner, leads are very widespread in sea ice environments, and they're common in all seasons, both the summer melt season, but also during winter. And for these, to determine what their contribution might be to gas exchange in these regions, eddy covariance isn't really ideal, as the footprint from even the smallest eddy covariance mast is much larger than the typical water surfaces that you can see in these kind of photos here. So one of the approaches I've been trying is using floating chamber flux measurements, which is literally an upturned floating bowl on the water surface connected to some sort of analyzer, with the flux then determined from the changing gas concentration. This is a very sensitive measurement. It can measure very small fluxes, but the chamber itself has some kind of hard to quantify impact on the surface mixing and so on gas exchange. We can minimize this impact through the chamber design, but we can't eliminate it entirely. This is also quite a labor-intensive technique, and it requires access to the ice. You have to go out there and do it. And it can be done from a ship, but is quite challenging to do so, or quite challenging to do without a lot of biases in the measurement. Okay, but in a recent campaign, we did do this in the sometime Central Arctic, and we used these chambers to measure the fluxes in the leads, as shown in the picture of both, and we measured the fluxes of both CO2, but also methane, which was a consistent flux that we found everywhere. We went really, although it was a very small flux in the Central Arctic. And we found with these measurements, especially when we kind of chose only the best quality measurements, that we really found very, very little wind speed dependence in these measurements. We had near constant K, even up to relatively high wind speeds, so this kind of blue line shown here. Now we think this is due to kind of sheltering of these leads by the ice edges and the limited size, limited kind of wave fields in these leads. But of course, it might also be due to the bias for the chambers themselves affecting the measurements. But it kind of highlights that we need to account for these kind of spatial factors somehow in our estimations of gas transfer in these sea ice regions. I should also mention that grease ice was an issue in some of these measurements, which tends to form in kind of sheltered parts of leads. Now, in sampling from the ice, we also took kind of high vertical resolution water samples, and we saw strong vertical gradients of temperature, salinity, and gas concentration. So I'm just going to finish by talking a little bit about this near surface stratification, which Josefa did a really nice job talking about this as well in her talk. And there's also some really nice work by Maggie Smith at Hui on meltwater and freshwater lenses in the Arctic. So I'm just going to kind of say a few things in this area. So these kind of, what I'm talking about here, really this kind of these freshwater layers, we might call kind of thin transient freshwater lenses, perhaps, which can form during the melt seasons in basically, well, all over the Arctic. And by their nature, these thin transient layers are hard to detect, either from remote observations from satellites or aircraft, but they're also hard to detect from ships and other typical in situ platforms. So we don't really know how widespread they are during these kind of summer melt seasons, as they can be easily taken away by mixing, for example. But when they are carefully looked for, they are often detected. For example, Maggie Smith reported several occurrences of these layers during Mosaic. That's shown in some of these profiles from her recent paper here. And they have very strong salinity gradients. So here's it's going from like 30 odd to close to 0 PSU in these profiles here, as you see. So very very fresh water right at the surface. Similarly, in a campaign I was on in 2024, we have these similar such layers. So again, in these kind of upper few meters, the salinity drops from around 30, these typical Arctic values, down to kind of, well, certainly less than 10. And as Josefa talked about, these has several impacts on gas exchange, both from suppressing mixing, so reducing the turbulence near the surface from the stratification, but also affecting the pCO₂ from dilution and from these kind of chemical processes as well. So the net effect of such layers is not really, I would say, well known at this point. And finally, I just want to really emphasize the challenges such layers present to determining gas exchange. And this is because we typically estimate gas exchange by effectively measuring the dissolved gas concentration at what should be the air-sea interface, but in practice is several meters below this depth. Certainly if we're measuring from a ship, from an icebreaker, we're going to be quite a few meters below the surface. So if we're measuring below a freshwater layer, we are going to have some kind of bias in our measurements. And this is the same bias reported in this nice paper by Lisa Miller from 2019, when she was looking at measurements in Canadian coastal waters. What I want to highlight here is I think this bias might be quite widespread in the Arctic, not just in the coastal waters, but also in the central Arctic during the melt season. And it's an example here of some kind of underway measurements from an icebreaker operating in the north of Greenland. You can see that in this period here, we have this kind of typical salinity here around 30. And this is measurements of around 8 meters depth. But then during this period here, something strange happens, and the kind of salinity is bouncing around from 30 to kind of down to 5 or so. And these red points here are when the ship was stationary. So when the ship was stationary, then we're always measuring this kind of 30. And then when it's moving, we're measuring much lower salinity. And what's happening is that the underway intake is down here. So we're measuring in this kind of normal water. And then when the ship's moving, it's drawing water from lower depths, being pushed down by the ship's hull down to the intake. So then we're measuring up in this very strong freshwater layer up here. So we have this kind of speed-dependent gradient of salinity. And the same effect is seen then in the pCO₂ that was measured on the underway line. So we have these kind of higher values here when the ship is stationary, and then when the ship's moving, we have much lower value. And this difference here is something like 150 or more microatmospheres. So huge bias if you're trying to estimate your kind of flux estimates in these kind of situations. Okay, so I just wanted to highlight that as a challenge. Okay, I've probably gone slightly over time, so I'll just leave my summary slide there. And yeah, thank you all very much for listening.
Great. Thank you very much for this nice overview, John. And with this, it is open now for discussion. So if you have any questions, as I said, write them in the chat or speak up. I cannot see everybody, but just speak up if you have any questions. I don't see anything in the chat. I don't know, Karin, if you have something.
Yeah,
Otherwise, people can just
I had
speak up.
a comment for Josefa that her results were quite interesting to me as a global climate modeler, and thinking about adding ice sheet meltwater, that maybe this is something that should be considered. I mean, most models wouldn't have this.
Yeah, definitely. And also because it's important to collect samples for TA and DAC always, even though you are measuring continuously with sensors. Yeah, I realized that, yeah, even though you have like these high frequency measurements, you still need the TA and DIC to decipher what were the processes contributing, and especially what is the TA and DIC ratio. So this will be very important to see like how it will impact the carbon chemistry in seawater, and what will be the effect of mixing those different sources of waters.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you.
Lisa, go ahead.
Yeah, sure. Just following right on that, Josefa, that was really interesting. Thank you so much. Did I understand correctly that your results show that the melt pond water has a higher TA to DIC ratio than the sea ice melt water? Is that what you were saying?
The TA, sorry, here. Yeah, there are different ratios exactly. So melt pond water contains a lower ratio of that found in seawater. So it's kind of, it decreases the ratio. That's why we see like different effects between snow and sea ice and the melt pond water. So it depends on the stage of melt of the melt pond, and
Right.
exactly, and
So-
how much contact it has been with the atmosphere.
So how does the TA to DIC ratio compare between the melt pond water and the sea ice melt?
Yeah. So so your question is what will be the impact of both
No.
of them?
What is the TA to DIC ratio in
Yeah.
the melt pond versus the sea ice melt?
Yeah, in the melt pond is lower than in seawater, and seawater is the TA and DIC ratio is higher. It's slightly higher than that in seawater. If I recall that
Okay,
correctly.
just
Yeah.
so you're saying the melt pond water actually has a lower pCO₂ than the sea ice melt.
Yes.
So
Yes.
that implies a higher TA to DIC ratio in the melt pond water than the straight sea ice melt, correct?
Yeah.
Okay, so this is really interesting because I'm speculating, and I'm looking at Odile too, thinking about why that would be, why the melt pond water would have the higher TA to DIC ratio, and I think this is something that we could play with. Thank you. Sorry,
Yeah,
it took a while to dig that out.
Yeah, no, it's fine.
Maybe we do one more question for Josefa in the chat, and then we move on to John. I don't know if you see it. So it says, maybe I just read it. It says, "Thank you for these talks. They were highly instructive." And for Josefa, what is the portion of change due to physical dilution, meaning adding new water, versus the effect of dilution on the chemistry of the water?
Yeah. Dilution, sorry, tends to physical dilution, adding new water versus the effect of dilution on the chemistry of the water. Yeah. The port, yeah, it is mainly like the pCO₂ reduction is mainly caused by this conservative mixing. This means only dilution, just like by fresh water. So this, yeah, but this actually, like now that I think about, like I will need to rethink about this question on the chemistry of the water. Yeah, between dilution and the chemistry. Yeah, I have to rethink about that. Yeah, it made me think. I cannot like really like, maybe I can come back to you. Yeah.
Okay. Maybe just quickly one from myself, out of curiosity, do we have any idea, maybe on a regional or large scale basis, what is the impact on the budgets of this snow and sea ice melt? Because this seems to be very important. Do we have any idea how much could it be? Would you venture in saying how important it could be regionally?
Yeah, I don't have like these numbers in my head. But I think like, yeah, it should be like included in the regional budgets, definitely. Yeah. But also like it's a bit complicated because it depends on the TA and DAC ratio and from these different sources, and also like how long it has been in contact with the atmosphere as well, this melt pond water, because this will also influence how much CO2 it has been taking up by these melt ponds, the volume, the extent of melt ponds. So like, yeah, it's needed to, yeah, it's not so easy to account with those processes as well.
Yeah. Okay. Good. Thank you. So we have a question now for John. I don't know if you could you see it in the chat, John. I will read it shortly for those who don't see the chat maybe. So it says, nice talk, John. Would it be possible to compare eddy covariance and chamber CO2 transfer velocity estimates for the open ocean to determine any bias caused by the chamber, for instance, modifying the turbulence? So you could then apply that to understand the chamber flux measurements in the leads.
Yes, sure. Yes, I mean, it's definitely possible. And my PhD student is trying to do this with some coastal measurements we've been doing, although she's now on maternity leave, so there's going to be some delay in that. But yeah, I think people have often wanted to do this, and probably there are some estimates out there of it. I've tried to do it on some of these campaigns, but it's often quite hard to get everything working at the same time. And of course, then with them very restricted by how much actual ship time we get to kind of position the ship in the way we want, where we can go out in a boat and put the chambers consistently in the flux footprint. So, but it's harder than it sounds, but of course it's not impossible. So I think it definitely should be done so we have a better idea of what these biases are.
Okay. I see that. Thank you for posting the paper. It's a very nice one. I agree.
Yeah, that's good.
Are there any other questions for John? I cannot see. I would have one, but of course I would wait for somebody else. Doesn't seem like it. So just going back to the near surface bias, that's a bit of a problem. Obviously, it's great to know. But it's, with underway systems, not only for CO2, but for, all sort of greenhouse gases being the standard, not only in research vessels, but also nowadays in vessels of opportunity. It is, of course, important to see that there is a bias. So perhaps from an operational perspective, what can we do about it?
Yeah, I mean, the good thing is that as the bias isn't so bad when you're away from quite heavy sea ice regions. Anywhere where there's a lot of wind mixing, then you're at least having
Mhm.
relatively well mixed operation, typically way below the depth of the intake on a ship. And then you're getting into kind of the biases caused by this kind of surface, right, the temperature gradients right at the surface, which are
Yeah.
affecting affecting the fluxes in these quite subtle ways, which I think there's been some really nice papers on recently that I haven't been involved with. So those are really important for kind of open ocean conditions. But we can see this really strong stratification can be very persistent in sea ice regions. It's
Mhm.
tricky. It's tricky to handle because it's there's practical reasons why you can't have the intake at different depths, and even like on an
Yeah.
iceberg, the intakes at even 8 meters depths are often problematic to use if you're actually breaking ice because there's a lot of ice and air
Right.
moved into it, and then if you have a CO2 sensor on that line, it's what's it measuring? It's measuring water, air, all these kind of things. As you know,
Yeah.
Damian, you've done the kind of methane measurements in these kind of situations. So
Yeah. Yeah. You don't want to have the ice there. Yeah. That's true. Yeah.
I mean,
Okay.
it's really nice for a lot of this stuff to really, to get off the ship and do it. But then, of course, it's that's slow, it's dangerous, and you immediately you have even more sparse data than you would have if you're just steaming around in a ship. So yeah, it's
Yeah.
a tough problem.
Yeah. So it's a bit of a trade-off if you want the small scale and understanding of the process, or you want to have the regional scale. So it sounds like we probably should develop a way of correcting the data, because operationally, I mean, I don't have any clever idea on how to solve this operationally with the systems because of what you're saying. So it would appear we might have to think clever ways on how to maybe account for it, at least when we look at our
If we
data.
could,
It
just
seems to me at
understanding.
least.
If we just had a better understanding of this kind of real operation of physics, and we could model that better when these layers are present.
Yeah.
But first we have to actually determine when these layers are there or not, and even that's a bit of an unknown at the moment, I think.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you very much. Do we have any other questions in the room? Let me see. Don't think so. Okay, so it's 4 o'clock. So thank you very much again to both speakers, Josefa and John. Thank you to those of you who made it today and joined this seminar. And well, I wish you a nice afternoon or morning for those of you in different time zones. And well, we'll see you soon. This was very nice and very insightful. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.